Hello, art lovers. I'm Susan Paragallo, Gallery Coordinator and Curator of the Art League of Long Island at the Jeannie Tangleson Gallery. Welcome to our first online gallery talk. The current exhibition is the Big Picture, an exhibition of large format works. We at the Art League are aware of the difficulties that artists producing large format works face in finding venues to exhibit. It was our intent to present an opportunity to those artists. In all, 105 artists took up the challenge and submitted 255 works, from which the juror, Dr. Charles Riley II, director of the Nassau County Museum, selected 33 pieces to be installed in the Jeannie Tangleson Gallery. The gallery can usually hold about 60 works, but fitting all these 33 in was tight. The result was truly stunning. Here's a quick look at the show. The juror, Dr. Charles Riley, is a summa cum laude graduate of Princeton University and received his Ph.D. from the Graduate Center of CCNY. He is currently the director of the Nassau County Museum of Art, an international curator, and author of 32 books. His most recently published book is Free as Gods: How the Jazz Age Reinvented Modernism. Dr. Riley is also a sought-after guest commentator, having appeared on CNN, NBC, and CBS, among other major media venues. We are truly honored to have had Dr. Riley as our juror for the Big Picture exhibition. He has graciously agreed to speak to you about his award selections and his thoughts about the exhibition. So, without further ado, may I present Charles A. Riley II.
Thank you, Susan, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, Art League, for making me a part of the Big Picture. What an honor it was to be on the jury. I'm Charlie Riley. I'm the director of the Nassau Museum of Art. And it was my great pleasure, actually, to work with Susan on this show. It was actually great fun to come and see the show after it was hung. I thought, Susan, you did a wonderful job of hanging the Big Picture. It's not easy to work with paintings of this scale. They take up a lot of real estate. They have needs, and it's not easy to find the proper juxtapositions. I thought that on the upper level, on the lower level, the rhyming pairs that you set up, the ways in which you, shall we say, turn the corner from one work to the other, absolutely wonderfully installed. And of course, it was such a pleasure, having seen many of these as images, to see them in the flesh. As this is just the way I love to work anyway. I don't enjoy looking at works of art on a screen. I like to smell the oil on canvas, or in this particular case, actually, there's so many media in this exhibition. It's so exciting, from oil on canvas to watercolors and woodblock prints. But I thought we'd take a moment before I launch into my incredibly boring lecture to ask these other questions about big in art or in the arts. Actually, it's a question of aesthetics. What's the correlation between big and power? Uh, Later in this lecture, I'm going to talk about art history and some of the great, huge paintings that one sees, for instance, at the Louvre. But what about, for instance, literature? When you have an epic, Homer, Virgil, Dante, Milton, or a great, huge novel by Dickens or Thackeray, or a five-act tragedy, Sophocles, Aeschylus, Shakespeare. What does scale do in literature? What does scale do, for instance, in music? I guess I think about that because we have this beautiful painting of a cellist, and I happen to love Brahms, and I like Brahms symphonies. Maybe you were thinking of Beethoven, or even Handel, the oratorios. When Handel's Messiah, for instance, was done in the 19th century with huge orchestras and huge choruses, numbering the hundreds of people, what did scale, what did big do to the power of these works? Let's ask that question a little bit later in this talk, but let's first start with this fantastic show. I was so taken the minute I saw it by this watercolor by Joseph Sankar Pia. It was an obvious award of excellence, in my opinion. I love the diagonal composition of this thing. It uses the sheet so beautifully. There's a limited palette here, but look at the way in which the dynamism of that flesh is. I mean, it reminded me a little bit of one of my favorite artists, Lucian Freud. Actually, maybe it's just the composition itself, but boy, there was talk about this, the correlation of power and scale, physical scale. This was a really, really good example of it. Since we're talking about the figure, how about that cellist, Angelus Stratton, the cellist? I probably am a bit of a sucker for art that has to do with music. I happen to love the cello too. It made me, this beautifully rendered cello made me think of some of my favorites. I mean, everybody talks about Yo-Yo Ma, and I think he's a marvelous genius, frankly, in many, many ways. But I also like Pierre Fournier and Casals. I guess everybody loves Casals and Rostropovich. Look at the diagonal here also, and also if you're looking for power, it's not just the drama of this, the quiet narrative, that pensive look, but there's that diagonal composition again, and the chiaroscuro, the play of light across her brow and shadow. I thought this was a fascinating painting by Tian Hui. It's called Andy Warhol in China. I lived in China when that jacket, that blue jacket especially that he's wearing, the little flash of red at her collar, which was could be the bandana of a young pioneer. So that's got to be the 60s or 70s or maybe the early 80s. It certainly doesn't look like China today unless you're in the countryside. I enjoyed this very, very much, actually, because I'm also a bit of a sucker for Austrian expressionism. I looked at those hands and thought immediately of Sheila. I love the play of primary colors in this, the blue, the red, and the wonderful yellow. When I brought someone who just came from China in the 1980s for political reasons to the Met, I remember walking in front of the Andy Warhol portrait of Mao Zedong, and she stopped in her tracks and looked up and really with a look of astonishment on her face and said, "You could go to jail for that in China." So I kind of like the title Andy Warhol in China as well. This is a great big figural painting with all kinds of power to it. Now let's go to another medium, and this is a virtuoso woodcut print by Beth Atkinson. It's called Catterskill Falls. We were just talking about China. It has some of the wonderful cascading vertical composition of a great Chinese landscape scroll. And like Tian Hui's work, there's a nice arabesque in this that takes you from top to bottom. And finally, what gives it its power? It's not just the scale, but it's the way in which the play of details and the rhythms of it. There's a wonderful rhythm of it that sort of takes you from top to bottom or from bottom to top, depending on how you're feeling, and engages you. That's power too, isn't it? And speaking of arabesques, look at Joyce Cubot. Red 1, ink and acrylic on paper. I had to look at this very, very carefully to try to sort out how what the process was here. And just like the woodcut, it has a marvelous rhythm to it, and very, very like the watercolor that I enjoyed. It's another figure, isn't it? And, though it has its quality of abstraction, it definitely has its expressionist quality too, and that lovely, lovely arabesque, that curve of beauty. And finally, maybe it's because I'm sitting out here while my museum is closed, unfortunately, not too far from a beautiful creek that looks a lot like this on the North Fork. This is a big seascape called Harbor Reeds by Mary Jane Van Seitz. I hope I got her name correctly. It's sort of a duck's eye view of a distant. In my case, I would think of it as a bay. I thought immediately of Peconic Bay because this is right near where I like to go and find oysters. Actually, I enjoyed this diagonal too. Actually, maybe there's sort of a theme going on here in terms of composition. I like the muted palette. I think that if you're going to sort of open up the world on a canvas, this in this case 48 inches by 48 inches, this nice big generous square space, you're going to open up the sea. You need kind of scale such as this. Now, in person, you're maybe looking at it on a small screen, but in person, the effect of this is really to keep you moving and moving and moving toward that open water. Now, what about art history? How do we relate these wonderful paintings that we've been talking to, for instance, Jaricot, the raft of the Medusa, one of the most dramatic examples of big pictures that I could think of when I was just trying to think of some good art historical comparisons. Right, it's partly the size. This thing's 24 feet across, right? And then, of course, it's also partly the drama of what's going on there, all that human drama, all those figures writhing upon the sea, and then the color palette too. What does Jericho need here from the physical bigness of this picture in order to convey the tragic drama of the work that he's doing? Well, I guess what he's trying to do is sort of overwhelm us by its scale. Somebody else who knew how to do that extremely well was Rubens, of course. I might have chosen some of the works that he did, for instance, for the banqueting hall in London, always one of my favorite Rubens. This one I chose for its power because, frankly, I think that color conveys or can sort of employ power in and of itself, that vibrant red. It takes up a lot of space. It comes at you from the painting. So on the one hand, you've got the arabesque that I've been talking about. You've got the sheer physical size of this painting, but then you've got that other thing, which is that vibrant color palette, the way in which that red, I don't want to say screams at you, but comes at you. And if you should see, I hope you have seen the work of Kehinde Wiley, because I think it actually goes very well with a Rubens, and it definitely goes well with the work of David, who is, I think, one of his great influences, and to a certain degree, Ingres as well. I remember seeing the first Kehinde Wiley I ever saw was when I walked into the lobby of the Brooklyn Museum. You sort of talk about stopping you in your tracks. I thought, what? And it's that ornate frame as well. But this is where power is both metaphorical and literal, right? Because you've got the power of the size of the painting, and again of the color. Look at those primaries, but then you've got that sense of power, that sense of physical power that the work is attempting to convey. And finally, getting to abstraction. I had the privilege for a while when we had our energy show on the walls of having a really, really superb Julie Meritou, an early painting by Julie Meritou, an artist I've really admired for so long now. But it was when you have the work by that artist in your museum and you really get a chance to get to see it. And how does Meritou use scale? Well, this is one of her most famous works. It's the mural that she did for the investment banking firm Goldman Sachs. It's downtown in Manhattan. It's giant. As you can see, there's a figure walking across it. But look at all the action, look at all the detail. And one of the reasons why we had her in the museum is that look at all the energy that's captured in this huge work. On the one hand, It's the physical scale of a mural. Mural would be, the great example of a big picture, right? But it's not just that the thing stretches for, hundreds of feet. It's also the way in which she packs it with that kind of energy. And finally, really, the one I thought of when I was told that this was going to be the big picture. What's the big picture that I go to every time I'm at MoMA? It's Barnett Newman's Vir Heroicus Sublimis. It's this huge, expansive, amazing painting that envelops you when you're in front of it. Now, look, Newman was doing this at a time when a lot of them were creating huge, usually gestural, powerful paintings. Think of how big many of the drip paintings of Pollock are. If you've ever been out to Springs, you've seen the space in which he made them. They go from edge to edge, and you're standing in the middle of one of these things and you're enveloped by it. Think about a group of Rothkos surrounding you, or the big thunderstorms of Clifford Still, or the huge gestural abstraction of Franz Klein. Newman, when he created this painting in 1950, 1951, was sort of saying, I can make this go on forever. And it is in, by the way, MoMA, not too far away from another very, very large red picture. Can you guess the one I'm thinking of? Of course, it's Matisse's Red Studio. So I just thought I'd take you out on this note of the sublime, of a big picture that's doing so much, really, in with one fantastic idea and one very, very generous and vibrant color. That's the way I'd like to end the show. And again, I'd like to thank you, Susan, and thank the Art League for inviting me to be a part of this. It's been a great privilege and a great honor, and I look forward to welcoming you to the NASA Museum when we reopen, which should be, and I hope will be, very, very soon.